Hello, I'm David Hayward, the convener of the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution World Affairs series of talks. Shortly, I will be in conversation with the traveller, author and activist Louisa Waugh, whom I first came across in Palestinian Walks by Raja Shihada. Louisa was born in Berlin and grew up in Liverpool. Since leaving the city at the age of 18, she has lived and worked in Central Asia, the Middle East, Central and West Africa. In Mongolia, she was a correspondent for the BBC World Service before moving to a remote village in the Western Altai Mountains. Several years later, she moved to the Palestinian Gaza Strip, where she worked for the Palestinian Centre for Human Rights, investigating the killing of children in Gaza by the Israeli military. In the Central African Republic, where she lived for 2.5 years, Louisa managed a complex peacebuilding and dialogue project amidst a violent political conflict, before moving to Mali as the country director for an international peace-building organisation, International Alert. Louisa has also worked in armed violence reduction, coordinating programmes across West Africa for the Danish De-Mining Group. She now works as a senior conflict advisor for Saferworld, specialising in refugee and migrant rights and the political conflicts across the Sahel. Louisa's writing career reflects these diverse interests. Her first book, Hearing Birds Fly, about her time in a Mongolian village, won the inaugural Ondaatje Prize for the book that most evokes the spirit of a particular place. Her second book, Selling Olga, was a groundbreaking investigation into human trafficking across Europe and the Balkans, including Albania and Moldova. Her third book, Meet Me in Gaza, explores the lives of ordinary Gazans, fishermen, shopkeepers, farmers, and the odd acrobat, with jokes and pathos. Louisa speaks Arabic and French, writes a blog called The War Zone, that's spelt W-A-U-G-H, zone, and lives in Brighton. In her spare time, she also enjoys boxing. She is still in love with travelling. Hi, Louisa. Where are you talking to us from today?
I'm talking from, I was going to say sunny Brighton, but unfortunately it's not very sunny. It's a bit morose looking today.
Oh, I suppose one good thing about the weather being a bit quieter around Brighton is that there aren't so many people on the beaches today.
Yes, I haven't been to the beach yet, but I can't imagine there will be many.
But I believe you've just recently come back from a holiday to Scotland.
Yes, I was in the Highlands, where it was, in contrast to here, it was incandescent light, beautiful, radiant, views that were open. It looked until the end of the earth. Fresh air. It was very inspiring and very, very, they call it up in Shetland, the days between the weathers. And that's what it felt like.
Okay.
I was there for days between the weathers and they were very gentle and kind to me.
Good. In terms of travelling, you obviously managed to get up to Scotland and back without having to quarantine, which was good. But have you always been interested in travelling, or did it just kind of happen one day?
There's an old Scots word that I particularly love called a stravega, and a stravega is somebody who strolls. And I think in my heart I've always been a stravega. I can remember even when I was very young being completely fascinated by atlases at school and deciding early on that I was going to go to this city that looked as though it was in the middle of the earth, called Ulaanbaatar, and another one called Mandalay that looked as though it was falling off the ends of the earth. So yes, I think I'm a stravega down to my bones, and I've always been in love with travelling.
Okay, you mentioned Ulaanbaatar, and that's where you started off from when you were doing the travelling around Mongolia that became the basis of your book, Hearing Birds Fly. So this book kind of looks at your life over the course of about a year. How did you happen, though, to end up in this small village, which was what, Sengel? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Sengel.
Sengel, okay.
Sengel means delight. And Sengel village is in the province of Bainolgi, which means the rich cradle. The furthest west province in Mongolia, 2,000 kilometers from Ulaanbaatar. And it wasn't quite by chance, but there was quite a lot of serendipity involved. I was working in Ulaanbaatar, editing an English language newspaper and also reporting for the BBC World Service as the Mongolia correspondent, which is quite random. And after 2 years, I took a trip out of Ulaanbaatar. It wasn't my first, but it's my furthest. And I realized that my knowledge of what went on in the remote areas was very, very limited. And so with my impetuous nature, I thought, right, that's it. I'm going off to the mountains. So I wrote to all the village governors of the 21 provinces, and only one replied. And it was the governor of Sengel village. And he sent me a telex. That's how long ago it was. And they were the facilities available. So on the basis of a one-line telex that said, we need a teacher, come to the village, I went off to the village of delight and I stayed there for a year. And it was without doubt the toughest experience, and at times the most wonderful, not always. Sometimes it was just bloody hard work. But it was quite an amazing year, and I felt like I understood something about what was going on in the mountains with nomadic communities as a result of living amongst them for that time.
Yeah. And during this time, you had to learn not only Mongolian, but Kazakh as well, because most of the people living in this village appeared to be Kazakhs.
Yeah, there were Tuvans, who are traditionally shamanic people, Kazakhs, who are traditionally Muslims, and then the minority was the Half Mongols, who are Buddhists. So it was a real cultural melting pot. People spoke 3 different languages. And I think what was interesting for me was to be in a village that was on the edge of a country and on the edge of these different cultures that collided together, not always harmoniously, and managing those quite complex relationships between different communities who lived in, it's not elemental chaos, but it's a very, very tough environment.
Yeah.
People died every year going across the river. The river that flowed through the village was frozen for 6 months of the year. There was fruit and vegetables available once a year. The post came once a week. There were 2 telephones in the entire village. It was really out there in the elements. There was no electricity or running water. And it was really tough. And I was proud of myself for lasting a year. And I found the people there, they were tough too. And I made very good friends with whom a couple of them I'm in contact with until today.
That's great.
And I just learned how to live there from day to day. And when people asked me why I went there, it was just where I wanted to be at that time. And I think that was what made it such a rewarding experience. I had no ambition beyond being there at that time and trying to write about it.
Mm-hmm. 3 years after returning from Mongolia, though, you're in the Balkans and you're researching for your next book, Selling Olga, which is about human trafficking, particularly the trafficking of girls and women for the European sex industry. How did that change come about?
I became very interested in shadow economy and what goes on underneath the mainstream economy, and how criminality and organised or disorganised crime can be a huge feature of what goes on at national and transnational level. And I think that not only the horrifying experience of trafficking, but the aftermath of people who had survived it psychologically was something that I became very interested in. I worked as an advisor to the UK Human Trafficking Centre. And then, as you say, I spent quite a lot of time in the Balkans interviewing women who had been trafficked. And I really wanted to write about how they survived these experiences, and also how they had to live with the consequences of what had happened to them, and how that had been part of an economy And Mark Duffield, who's an academic who writes a lot about global development, talks about networked conflicts. And that's part of the work that I do now in peacebuilding. But network conflicts is about the power of networks, of gangs and economies to change geographies and to operate transnationally. And in the middle of all that, you have individual experiences, which is what I've always focused my writing on. And the experiences were extraordinary. And the price that people had paid for living in an economy that didn't function in a way that allowed the mainstream economy to flourish and therefore people to survive, left them making incredibly difficult choices. And I think between smuggling and human trafficking, there's a whole range of different experiences. And I wanted to look at those experiences, some of the ambiguities, but most of all, the personal stories of people who have come through that.
Yeah, that comes across very strongly, I must admit. And not only that, but the relationships that you build up with the people in those countries who are trying to help comes across very strongly as well. But it wasn't just about the Balkans. It was also Italy and the UK, where you came across these people being trafficked. I mean, we shouldn't forget it isn't just something that happens over there. It's something that's happening in the heart of our society as well.
Yes, and it still is. In Italy, there were whole very, very successful trafficking networks. Yes, I had that too. Run by women. And in the UK, I mean, there has been publicity and then it dies down, but it's an ongoing consequence, I think, of the political economies that we have, and also of the power of these networks. Mm. And it isn't only about legal frameworks, but it's about the protection of civilians. And I think it's about the whole way that our economy runs and the price that other people have to pay. It's about immigration. It touches on lots of controversial subjects. And I think that if I had known the things that I learned in advance, if I'd known what I was going to learn about what people go through, I don't think I would have written that book. Because when you learn about these things, you can't unknow them. Mm. And I think that's a conflict for any writer who does investigative nonfiction, is what you expose yourself to in order to tell stories, and the importance of that, and of taking the responsibility for that yourself. And also, as we're going to talk about later, is how unreported stories, otherwise they just go missing, and whole lives go missing. And then the questions that they present us with us and the moral conundrums go missing. And I think it's really important as writers that we do raise these up as issues to be debated and confronted, however messy they are. Yeah. How much they kind of force us to look at the implications of the lifestyles that we have.
Mm-hmm. In the introduction that I did, I referred to you as an author and activist. How do you feel that your writing best provokes change?
What I have spent my working life doing through being a counsellor, a writer, and now a conflict advisor is to encourage people to have conversations that they often assume they don't want to have. And I think that's what the best writers do. I mean, we just talked about our mutual friend, Raja Shahada. And I think that the great power of his writing is the nuance that defies the black and whiteness of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the occupation of Palestine by Israel, and his real ability to talk about his Israeli friends, to talk about the failures of the Palestinian Authority, to address those really difficult, nuanced subjects that raise really awkward questions. When I was in Gaza, I used to have phone calls with Raja, and also with a really, really well-known Israeli writer who was a very proud Zionist and right-wing. And he and I had difficult telephone conversations because I had previously interviewed him, and then he asked to talk to me when I was in Gaza. And they weren't easy conversations. They were very delicate, but we were both willing to talk about something that was hard for both of us. And to me, that's the whole point of the writing that I do, is to try and have those more difficult conversations and to focus on what that tells us about the bigger picture.
Okay, you've slipped into talking about Gaza a bit. I'm just going to take you back a little bit, because it was 3 years after researching and writing Selling Olga that you started work in Gaza, visas permitting. And I mean, that's one of the details that you bring out in Meet Me in Gaza, the difficulty of passing between Israel and the Gaza Strip. You moved to Gaza to work for the Palestinian Centre for Human Rights. How did that come about again? And I'm certainly not looking for you to kind of try and précis the book, because I think that people should read the book because it's fascinating. But in terms of, you know, how and why Gaza on this occasion?
Because I'm very interested in places that have their own mythology that most of us have heard of and very few of us will be able to go to, which I think is Gaza is a classic definition. And I wanted to go and see it for myself. I managed to get a job there through a contact. Then it was a very complex process to get in. And I wanted to see all the layers of Gaza that hadn't been reported. And I to this day, when I tell people that some of the best parties I've ever been to in my life were in Gaza. Gaza has a fantastic lingerie market. The people are fiercely hospitable. The hammam, the ancient hammam, is so beautiful, inlaid with wonderful lamps and rugs. And that is not to talk down the horrific suffering, the violence, how sealed it is, what that does to people's mental health, which is a huge issue. It is to just explore those other corners, like the acrobat on the beach, like the story of the fisherman, like the amazing food. And I think the real tragedy of Gaza is that it's like a pinball that is subject to all these other political agendas. You know, we've just mentioned the normalization of relations between Israel and the UAE, the relationship between Gazans and Egyptians. And beyond those political frameworks are 1.7 million people trying to survive in a place that's barely bigger than the Isle of Man. And that, to me, they are stories that were really worth telling. And my experience there is something that has stayed with me until today. And going to Gaza was one of the best decisions that I ever made.
Yeah. In terms of your 3 books, I really liked all of them, but the one that was the most revelatory, for the very reasons that you mentioned, was Meet Me in Gaza, because it was just so normal at times. People enjoying themselves, you know, going to the beach, swimming in the sea, eating ice cream. It's normal, but then you know that behind that there is this terribly constraining life that they have to live.
Yes, and Marwan Barghouti, the great Palestinian writer, he was at the Edinburgh Book Festival years ago, and he said, when you hear about us Palestinians, all you hear about is us killing other people or other people killing us. We're like you. I always remember what he said. We shout at our kids. We make love to our wives. We drink. We have parties. We're just like you, but we are never portrayed like this. And I think the beauty of that is it's so simple, but there's a real truth to it. And so these are the writers that I admire, and these are the stories that I try to tell.
Yes. You, I believe, spent some time in Israel when you were in your late teens, early 20s.
Yeah.
Did you, you know, how did you find that? And what was the kind of the difference between the 2 perspectives that you saw, you know, looking from Gaza, looking from Israel?
I don't think that there are 2 perspectives. I think there's a multitude. you know, but what you really see is mirrors between these different cultures. And I lived in Mesharim, which is the most orthodox part of Jerusalem, for a while. And I've also been in the most conservative parts of Gaza. And there are mirrors between them. It's like the Israeli government and Hamas and Fatah. They're like mirrors to each other. So I actually think the similarities are far more interlocked than the differences. And that one of the many reasons that the conflict is so entrenched is because the peoples are so similar. And in some ways, the governance structures are so similar.
Sounds
one of the things I did.
It's a bit like the Cold War.
Yes.
Both Russia and the US needed each other to justify their existence in a way.
And what I think the profound difference is, Palestine is not occupying Israel. And that's actually what gets forgotten. And that's an absolute. But in terms of the people, I met a number of Israelis who were very frustrated that they couldn't go to any part of Palestine to talk with their counterparts that they were working with on peacebuilding projects. So there's layers and layers of complexity to what goes on in Israel and Palestine. I reserve my ire for the Israeli government. And I think that the peoples of Israel are as complex as the peoples of Palestine and as the rest of us. It's a very multi-layered society with a myriad of viewpoints, and also lack of access for people to decide for themselves, which is where I think having these nuanced conversations is the most important thing, where people are exposed to the realities of those they maybe consider the other.
Yes.
And then there's another coherence to what they see, how they can actually relate to the fear that they all feel.
Yeah. Well, you were in Gaza in the early, around 2010. What have you been doing since then? We haven't seen any books from you since then. So what have you been doing?
Oh, you know, sitting around for the last 10 years. After my third book, I decided that I was going to go and do something quite different. And I moved into the peacebuilding sector. I went to live in the Central African Republic. It was another kind of serendipitous thing that happened, but I moved out there 3 months after the big rebel takeover by the Seleka rebels in 2013, and I stayed there for 2.5 years, managing a complex peacebuilding project. After the Central African Republic, I moved to Mali. And I joke with people sometimes that the only reason I went to live in Mali was so that I could actually go to Timbuktu, which is not true. But I was managing security governance programming. I was the country director for a peacebuilding organization. And I did spend quite a bit of time in Timbuktu. And as I said earlier, my work is around encouraging people to have conversations that they often assume they don't want to have, and they quite often do, but people are afraid. And it was about working with communities to reduce violence, to build up trust. After being in Mali, I went to Senegal and I coordinated violence reduction programs regionally. And I'm now a conflict advisor with Saferworld, which is another peacebuilding organization. So I've spent kind of the last 8 years in this sector, writing my blog, traveling as much as possible. I've been very lucky. I've traveled extensively around West Africa. And I'm very interested in issues around dialogue and about how you hold international actors accountable for their actions, which again goes back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, complex conflicts, responses of individuals and communities, and holding people accountable, and talking about complex realities and protecting civilians. And these are things that really drive my work.
Since you've been working in this area, have you seen conflicts changing in their form, or have the last 10 years have conflicts been basically the same? And if the conflicts are changing in their form, what's that meant in terms of what you've had to do for peace building? You talk about getting people together. What about, you know, at the government level? What do we need to do there?
Work on governance is huge and very complex, and it's about holding governments to account, which I think donors have been very reluctant to do. The nature of many international conflicts has changed. They've gone from being interstate between states to intrastate, which is conflicts across one state, what we would have called civil wars. There are huge challenges to people working in the humanitarian sector. And I think that a lot of humanitarian organisations have to some extent been co-opted, not only by governments, but also by external actors like the EU, the US, with regard to troop deployments, and how some troop deployments use humanitarian actions as intelligence gathering exercises. There's the whole question of terrorism and counterterrorism, which is addressed brilliantly in podcasts such as Rukmani Callimachi's podcast, The Caliphate, which looks at the situation in Iraq. And as somebody working in this sector, the way it's evolved has been very fascinating and also very frustrating, because there's such a small amount of money put into peace building as opposed to peacekeeping. The irony being, you can only do peacekeeping when you've got peace to keep. And you can't construct peace without funds and resources. And that takes time. And war and the selling of weapons is a very profitable business and industry. Yeah. And the organisation I work with is very, very political on that level. So I also work with the advocacy team, advocating for accountability, but based on bringing people from conflict-affected regions to decision makers to say, these are the realities that they are facing. These are the protection issues. These are the layers of accountability that are not happening. These are the governance issues at national and international level. These are the conversations that we need to be having. Okay. And this is the work that I will do for the rest of my working life, because I don't want to do anything else, and I love it.
Okay. I'm just going to ask you a brief question, because in the introduction, I mentioned that you worked with the Dutch De-Mining Group.
Yes, Danish.
I have no idea what that is.
The Danish De-Mining Group is part of the Danish Refugee Council.
Okay.
It's working on the armed violence reduction programme, which again was working with communities, doing a lot of training on armed violence reduction in areas where people are very affected by armed violence.
Okay. I think it was the first time I tried to speak to you. You rushed in and said, "Oh, I've just come back from my Arabic lesson." So you're still learning Arabic, and I believe you have still some contacts, or you're doing work in Yemen. Is that correct?
I do some work on Yemen, and I do some work on Libya. Yes. Okay. And I think is it Shelley who said, "I can't take my head out of the East."
Okay.
And I think I'm a bit like that. I learned Arabic first of all in Gaza, and I have been studying it on and off ever since. I've had long gaps when I was working in French in West Africa. But I use an online platform called Netakalam, which means we speak. And my teacher is a Syrian refugee who now lives in Italy and is doing his master's in Italian in international relations. So I am still studying Arabic because I will be going back to the Middle East. That I know. What I will do about writing about the Middle East is not so sure, but I will go back and work in the Middle East again, because I can't take my head out of the East.
Okay, and that kind of brings me to my next question about, what are the stories that still go unreported, and do they matter? Why do they matter?
They matter because I think without them, our understanding is very limited. They matter because they help us to make sense of the world around us, which often seems completely out of control. I mentioned Rukmani Callimachi's podcast. It's a wonderful, wonderful form of storytelling. It talks about the stories of people who joined ISIS and why, and also why they left ISIS, which were often for the same reasons that they joined, for ideological reasons, because they could see that ISIS wasn't following Islam, which they loved and wanted to adhere to. I love books like The Guest House of Young Widows by Azadeh Moaveni that talks about the dangers of muscular secularism in the context of Tunisia. Without these stories, then our understanding of complex situations is like we have one eye closed. The New Internationalist magazine is very good at this. And it's not only writing, it's reportage, it's also music. I made a note of a great Syrian musician, Maya Yusuf, who is called the Queen of the Kanun, the 78-string zither. And she said, I love this quote, "The act of playing music is the opposite of death." And all these stories, all this music, I think, contributes to us understanding how interrelated people are and how experiences can be universal and how actually we can communicate with people that we think are other. We can have those difficult, nuanced conversations. We often laugh at the same bad jokes. Humour gets people through everything. So it's bigger than writing, it's music, it's graphic novels, it's the conversation that you and I are having, it's my relationship with Raja Shahada, my relationship with this quite terse Israeli writer who I had so much respect for. It's being confronted by realities that you don't like and seeing how much you can engage with them. They're the issues that I'm really interested in.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you know, for most of the UK and much of the world at the moment, everything is closed down because of COVID. Yeah. And all we're hearing, all the news is about COVID, really. So much is still going on out there that we just know nothing about. And it's really important that people still, you know, are interested in the broader issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned at the beginning that you're currently living in Brighton. But what does a travel writer do when they can't travel?
They do interviews on Skype with the royal battalions.
Person who asks, yeah, well, I might as well do that.
You read a lot more. You write your blog. I'm doing my job as a conflict advisor. You think about the next book that you want to write. And I also have time to think about other issues because I'm incredibly interested in different ways that people communicate. So I've been thinking quite a lot about cancel culture.
Oh, yes.
The letter that was sent to Harper's Magazine by, I think it's 150 writers. The awkwardness of the debate. And I have read different responses to it, including Nick Cave, who wrote a very interesting response on his, I think it's called his Red Hand newsletter, about how debate becomes filtered. And I think, again, for me, that responds to my interest in having difficult conversations and not assuming that the person who disagrees with you is wrong because they're not using the same language as you. And maybe they're not as eloquent as you, but that doesn't mean that what they have to say is not valuable. So I have time, I guess, to live in my head a bit more. And I was very lucky that I went away just before lockdown to see a friend of mine in Slovenia. And I will go away again. My plane tickets were just cancelled to Spain, so that's out of the window. But to be honest, I have a job. I have a lot of people who love me in my life. I have a nice place to live, and I live by the sea. And I guess the thing about this situation is it's made a lot of us realise how much we do have. I have been able to write, and also I'm able to question publicly, and I don't live in an authoritarian regime like Belarus where you pay a huge price for doing so. Yeah. And I think that's probably why I will always be an activist for the rest of my life, because also it's our job to shout out about what is going on. And there's a lot going on to shout out about.
So is there another book in the making at the moment, or are you just thinking about what you're going to be doing in the future?
I think that I probably will write another book. I'd be very interested in writing a book about iconoclasts.
Okay.
About different kinds of people who have remade the world around them. And the challenge for me is I really want to write that in comic form. Because I've realised...
comic form? Do you mean drawn comic?
No, comic. I mean, like, I want to write stuff that's quite funny.
Okay.
The darkest kind of humour, because that's also been one of the constants of my working life, is how people use real gallows humour to get them through the worst kind of situations. So I'm just beginning to take notes and thinking about the people that I would want to interview. I don't think I'd ever write fiction. And I think it's because I find the real world so fascinating that I don't actually think I have another lifetime to write fiction. But I have been thinking recently about my writing life and how I kind of want to, probably because we've all spent so much time at home and I've done so much reading, and now maybe it's time to start writing again. So this has come at a good moment. Okay. And I think it's also great. It kind of warms my creative flow, just having this sort of conversation and thinking about why you write and what you want to write about and who you want to represent in your writing. So it's very useful as well.
Okay, Louisa, it's been really great talking to you. As I mentioned again in the introduction, I came across you when I reread Palestinian Walks, Raja Shahada, and you're there in the last chapter, and it's not a very comfortable place where you are in the last chapter. There are lots of people who are being quite threatening, Palestinians being threatening to you, and Raja makes it very clear that you were feeling quite exposed, but came out of it and ended up having a good walk, but not an easy place to be. So I'm really glad that I followed up on that and read your books, because they are really interesting books that open your eyes to things that you probably wouldn't think about otherwise. Your love of people comes across incredibly strongly. And also, the way that you open up a book on a different life that you just wouldn't think about otherwise. So thank you very much.
It's been really good to talk to you. Thank you as well. You do a good interview. Oh, it's a very nice. It's a very nice exchange to have, and I've enjoyed it too. So
okay, thank you very much. Then I'll say goodbye.
Okay, bye bye.